Hello, everybody. I wanted to share a little story with you. Here, it's almost Christmas. One day, many years ago, an old man was sitting in his gas station on Christmas Eve. It was snowing, the weather was miserable outside, but he sat inside waiting for his customers, hot coffee on the stove, and a smile on his face. He hadn't really celebrated Christmas since his wife passed away. Well, that moment, a homeless man walks in the door. And he looks at old George and says, "I see you're kind of busy, so I'll just leave." Old George looks at him with a smile and says, "Not without something hot in your belly, you won't." So the man sits down. George hands him a thermos of beef stew. He says, "Well, I made it myself and it's pretty good, I'd say." So the homeless man sits down and he eats the beef stew with a smile on his face. Just then, the bell rang for service. Old George got up, went out to the truck, and it was a Mexican man, his wife, and he says, "My wife is pregnant. She's gonna deliver any moment, and can you help me?" Steam was rolling from underneath the truck's hood. He opened the hood and thought he saw a crack block. He says, "There's not much I can do for this truck." He says, "Can you please help me, sir?" So he walked around back, opened up his garage, and pulled out his old trusty truck, drove it around front, and says, "Sir, this isn't much to look at, but it'll get you there." So he loaded up the man and his wife in the truck, and off they went. He went back inside, and the man had gone. The thermos was empty, and there was an empty cup in the sink where he had drank some coffee. So George thought there probably wasn't going to be anybody else in this evening. So he went out back and started looking at the truck. He got underneath the hood and found out that it was only a broken radiator hose. So he changed it and he took the tires off his wife's old car, an old Lincoln Continental, and put the tires, which were brand new, onto the truck. Just then, when he got finished up, he heard a gunshot in front of the gas station. He runs out there, and there's a police officer on the ground. He takes the officer inside, and from his old medic training in the Army, he goes to work on him. The officer looks up at him and he says, "Don't worry, son. I can fix almost anything." The officer was in pain, so he gave him some pain pills from his old back medicine. He said that ought to do the trick. He dressed the wound, laid him back, and said, "You'll be all right." He looked at the wound again and said, "It's a through and through. You're a lucky man." The officer says, "Do you have a phone?" He says, "No, phone's not working. Let me go see if that radio works in your car." So he goes out to the car and sees the bullet went straight into the radio. He came back in and says, "You're just going to have to sit with me for a while and drink some coffee." He said, "That man's still out there with the gun." He says, "It'll be okay." About a minute later, a man walks in with a gun. It's a young kid, scared half to death, points the gun at him and says, "Give me your money, old man." George looks at him and says, "Calm down, son. Nobody else needs to get shot here tonight." He went over to his jacket and he pulled out $160 and says, "If it's money you need, here it is." He hands the boy over the money. He says, "What's got you in this mess, son?" He said, "I lost my job. My wife's pregnant. My son doesn't have any toys. We don't even have Christmas dinner. What kind of a man am I?" He says, "We're all in tough trouble these days, son, but we'll get through it. Have a seat." As he hands him the money, he takes the gun away and sets it on the counter. The police officer looks at him, shaking his head. He says, "Why'd you shoot me, son?" He says, "I was scared." Just then, the police car and the ambulance showed up. One of the officers came in and said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, I pulled in the gas station. Some guy over there in the tree shot me and he ran off." He said, "All right, let's get you in the ambulance." The boy leaned over and he says, "Why'd you do that?" He says, "Son, you got a whole life ahead of you. You really didn't mean to do it." Merry Christmas. A few minutes later, George went and got a big old box. Out of that box, he pulled out a small box, handed it to the boy, and said, "Give this to your wife." He opened up the box, and it was the biggest diamond ring he had ever seen. He said, "Martha told me it'd come in handy one day. I guess today's the day." In the other boxes were a bunch of toys that the oil dealers and stuff had given him, trucks and cars and stuff to hand out. He said, "Give these to your boy." He said, "Thank you." And he said, "I heard you telling the police officer I worked here." He says, "Yeah." He says, "I'll be here tomorrow for work." And he said, "Not tomorrow, son. I don't open on Christmas." He said, "Well, the next day then." Just then the boy left, and about 2 seconds later, the old homeless man walked back in. He says, "How you doing, George?" He says, "Pretty good." He says, "You know that Mexican couple you helped out there? Their son's going to grow up to be a doctor and save many lives." He says, "How you know that?" He says, "I just do." He says, "And that police officer is going to stop a terrorist attack and save thousands of people." George kind of looks a little, and he says, "Really?" He says, "Yeah. And that boy you saved tonight is going to make you rich beyond your wildest dreams. And you'll be with Martha in the end." George said, "How do you know such things?" He says, "I know a lot, actually. I knew you before you were born. I know you're a good man. I know everything you did tonight you were meant to do. It is written. I'd like to talk to you for a while longer, but for now I must go. There's a very important birthday party I must attend. It is my own. I am Jesus Christ." His dirty, tattered clothes turned to a white robe. He ascended to the heavens. George, with a smile, shut the lights off and headed to bed. I hope you enjoyed this story. I found it on the Heart Matters. This time of year I look for things to lift my spirits. And it did just that. And I hope it did it for you. You have a very Merry Christmas